Hello everyone and welcome to this month's video. I am Cam Weiland. I run the website Helping Writers Become Authors. And today we're going to be talking about beginnings and specifically about how to introduce your characters in the beginning of your story, how to hook readers with your character, and how to set up all the important parts of your character's development and arc that will happen in the entire rest of the story. You may be watching this on YouTube, or you may be listening to this as a podcast, as audio only. So if you prefer one or the other of those formats, you can find those on my website at Helping Writers Become Authors. If you're on YouTube, it's also linked down below. And if you'd prefer a transcript, if you'd rather read what I'm going to tell you, then you can also find that on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. So this video was actually inspired by a question I received, a couple of questions that I received about endings. And I'm going to talk about that in a future video, but first I thought I'd kind of bookend it by introducing some important considerations about how to begin your story. Because ultimately a lot of problems that we may have with the ending of our story really comes down to maybe some things that we didn't quite set up right in the beginning. If you can get the beginning of your story right, then generally speaking, the rest of the story will work out pretty well. And by the time you get to the ending, everything will fit together and make sense. However, part of knowing how to begin your story often has to do with knowing how you want to end your story. And not all of us know that. Sometimes we will be better off figuring out how we want the story to end in an outline or just, figuring it out in our heads before we sit down to write it. In which case that can answer a lot of questions about what would be the best choices for the beginning. If that's not how you work, or that's just not how this particular story came to you, then at the very least, once you do reach the end in your first draft, you'll want to kind of circle back to the beginning and make sure that you've considered some of the things we're going to talk about in this video and how they tie in with the ending that you have created, whether it sets it up the way you want it to. So I'm actually going to be talking about beginnings in two different videos. We'll talk about we'll do the next one in about a month or so. And this week we're going to talk about considerations for character in beginning. In the next video, we'll talk about considerations for plot and creating a structural hook for your story and things like that. Because the truth is, beginnings are so complex. There's so much that you have to kind of think about and juggle in the beginning of a story. Because not only is it a scene in its own right, and not only does it carry this momentous burden of needing to hook readers in and convince them that they want to invest in your story and keep reading, but you also have to lay the groundwork for everything that follows. You also have to create this perfectly orchestrated setup that then allows the dominoes in the rest of your story to knock into each other in a perfect line. So there's a lot to think about. I always say that the beginning is the hardest part of the story. Maybe that's just me, but considering how complex it is and just how many moving parts you have to juggle and how much pressure there is on getting it right, because if you don't, the rest of the story can be pretty great, but maybe nobody's going to read it. It's just a lot. So there's a lot of ground to cover. I'm certainly not going to be able to cover all of it in this video or the next video. So as always, I will leave lots of resources down below on YouTube and linked on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. The first thing to think about when you are trying to figure out how to introduce characters and begin your story is to think about how you want to use two particular techniques. And those are, the first one is the characteristic moment. Now, not all stories will put their primary focus on character in the beginning. However, for my money, and I'm going to say 90% of stories, beginning with character is going to be your best bet. And this is because readers are there for the characters. Characters, at the very least, are the avatars of the action that is going to unfold in the story. And we want to be able to relate to them and have somebody that we maybe not care about right away, but that we're interested in. And we think this is going to be someone that is going to keep my attention as I continue with this story, whether I'm watching a 2-hour movie or, investing maybe 10, 12 hours in reading a novel. So my recommendation is, whenever possible, open with a strong emphasis on character. And specifically, if it's possible, open with your protagonist. Now, this is something that isn't always possible in all stories, but if you can open with your protagonist, particularly in a novel, it gives you the opportunity to hook readers in on a more personal and relational level before you get into the action, which obviously in a written story in narrative fiction has to be explained, right? There's more, it's not the same experience as when you're in a movie and it's very visual. And that in itself can often be a great hook. And also keep in mind, when you have someone who's deciding if they want to read a book, they're not as captive an audience as they are when they've started a movie. Particularly if they're in a movie theater, like they've paid for it, they're sitting there, they're going to watch it. And so there is more of an opportunity for a leisurely unfolding of the first couple of scenes and the introduction of the character in a movie versus a book. Whereas in a book, readers are skimming, they're flipping through, they're deciding, is this worth my time? Am I going to be able to, ground and get present and actually pay attention to this book? Is it going to grab my attention? And so you need to figure out the best way to do that. In my opinion, dialogue is one of the single best ways. Dialogue necessarily indicates that there are characters on screen. So beginning with your protagonist, this person who presumably is the most interesting person in your story, and is the person who should be able to create the impetus and the momentum to convince readers to follow them throughout the entire plot. That should, in a story, that should be your single greatest hook. Therefore, beginning with your protagonist, it's two birds with one stone, right? You're introducing this very important character and the situations around them, but also ideally it's like a fantastic hook and it's what's going to grab readers and pull them in. And we'll be talking more about the structural hook in the next video that I'm going to do. So if you're beginning your story with your protagonist, the characteristic moment is really that introduction, right? So just generally speaking, a characteristic moment is pretty much the first dramatized scene in which your protagonist takes part. And ideally, what we're trying to accomplish in a characteristic moment is something that really shows readers who this person is, right? It's demonstrating key aspects of their personality. And more specifically, in this opening scene, it's demonstrating why they're interesting, why we are going to find this person entertaining and want to follow them throughout the story. Now, I do think it's really important, and this is true of everything that we're going to talk about in this video, but a lot of times when writers hear like a list of the things you want to include in your beginning, the characteristic moment, the hook, they start kind of thinking of these arbitrary scenes that would check those boxes, that would, be an interesting scene that introduces the protagonist. But often these can kind of feel tacked on, like they're there just to introduce the character. They're there just to hook the reader, rather than being an integral part of the scene or the chapter and the entire story that follows. So it's really important as you're going through a checklist like this for your story's beginning, that you're not just thinking, oh, this would be a cool scene, I'll stick it at the beginning of my story and that'll pull readers into the main story. But rather thinking, how can I create a characteristic moment or a hook or whatever else that is part of the main story, that is that first domino that leads into the rest of the story, but that also dramatizes the key aspects of the character and their personality and their relationships that is actually going to matter and affect the plot that follows. And that can be really tricky, because sometimes the first domino that we, feel is, the obvious beginning of the story isn't that exciting. It's boring. And we're going to talk about some techniques for that as well in the next video when we get into more of the plot and narrative stuff. But one of the best ways to create a dynamic characteristic moment is to also think about what kind of relationships you can bring into this opening scene. Now, ideally, as I say, it will be a relationship between the protagonist and a supporting character that is important to the story, right? That this scene we're seeing between these two people, whatever it is something that is initiating conflict, it's moving the plot, it's moving us toward that main conflict that we're introducing in the first act and that's going to be fully entered into by the second act. So you want it to be pertinent. But the advantage of bringing in a relationship dynamic right in that first scene, well, really there's many advantages. And I think primarily it's just the entertainment value, right? You've got two people, you have the immediate opportunity for dialogue which I like to say the dialogue is the purest form of showing rather than telling, because it's literally what's happening. It's literally just the words that are coming out of people's mouths. You don't have to describe it at all, really. And so you've got this immediacy. You've got immediately one of the most entertaining aspects of any story, which is the dialogue, which means you have opportunity for conflict, you have opportunity for, just witty confrontation. And it's a perfect way to show readers who these characters are, right? You're showing, not telling, and allowing the readers to see how these characters interact with each other, how their personality comes out through their words, what their default argument tactic is, just how do they move through a situation. And, within the context of your story, this relationship dynamic that might come up in your first chapter, it could be between friends and allies, or it could be between, frenemies at work. It could be cop buddies out on, their job. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the primary relationship within the story. Obviously, in a lot of stories, romances, for example, they don't meet the primary relationship character until later in the story. But you want to pick characters and situations that ideally are ones that are going to show up again later in the story, or at the very least foreshadow or mirror situations that will become pertinent and important later on. So that's something to think about. That's always one of the first things I think about when trying to plan an opening scene is how can I bring in an important relationship character and get the dialogue going as soon as possible. Another quick little tip that can also really energize an opening scene is think about how you can keep the characters in motion. How can they move? And that doesn't mean that they, have to be in a kung fu fight or some big action scene right away, because very often that isn't, in fact, the best choice for particularly written fiction, narrative fiction. But if you can impart a sense of movement, right? Maybe they're just walking across the room rather than sitting at a desk or something like that. That immediately just creates so much more opportunity to dramatize the world they're in, to dramatize the characters, to show their personality. So always think about how you can keep them moving, if at all possible, within the context of that opening scene. Okay, so when you are using or choosing how to use these particular techniques in introducing your characters in the beginning of your story, hopefully hooking readers, what are the factors that you need to be thinking about to make sure that these end up feeling very integral to the story? Because again, you're not just trying to think of the most entertaining scene you can possibly dream up and stick it at the beginning of your story. You're trying to think of the most entertaining scene ever that actually introduces all of the important elements and sets up the story that's to come. So it all feels like it's part of this cohesive whole. From a character perspective, obviously there are plot considerations as well. But from a character perspective, what you're thinking about, or what you should be thinking about when you're designing this opening scene and this characteristic moment that's going to introduce this character, is laying the groundwork for the character arc that will follow in the story. So the foundation of all character arcs is the tension, the conflict between one mindset and another, between the lie the character believes, which is a limiting perspective about the world that is now becoming dysfunctional as this story begins, and the thematic truth, which is the opposite of that and is a more expanded perspective that will allow the character to then operate more functionally within their life and within the purview of the plot. So that's the foundation. Now, in some stories, characters will overcome the lie and embrace the truth. In other stories, they won't. So it totally depends on what kind of arc that you've chosen to tell in your story. But either way, you want to be able to introduce the character's relationship to the lie and the truth in the beginning of your story. So as you're thinking about what characteristic moment is best to begin your story, also think about one that will dramatize your character's either belief in the lie, if they're starting there and presumably arcing into, a belief in the truth, or possibly arcing into, a more rigorous relationship with the lie where it gets worse. But if they're in a positive change arc and they begin, with this limiting perspective, with the belief in the lie, then think about ways that you can dramatize that in the beginning of the story. Now, it doesn't have to be, full on. Some lies are very subtle. They're not, horrible things with people in horrible lifestyles and, doing really destructive things to themselves or others. But just think about how you can start to show, right? Because this is the beginning of the story. This is what kicks it all off. What is this tension that is suddenly being created in this character's life that hasn't been there before, that is creating the need for them to evolve out of the limitations of this lie, this mindset, into a more expanded and functional and effective viewpoint that they'll be learning over the course of the story through the, the moments and the action and the plot. So think about that, because that is really what needs to be dramatized within the characteristic moment, right? Because the point of the characteristic moment is that you're showing readers this is who this person is. And at the beginning of your story, who this person is someone who believes the lie and someone who is now beginning to find that ever so slightly uncomfortable, right? The circumstances of their life are changing to allow this potential for evolving into a more expanded truth. And obviously that's the whole saga of the story, and you won't get to that completely until the end. But it's also kind of nice, depending, on how deep your character is in the lie, and if indeed you are telling a positive change arc, to show the potential that the character has for evolving into the truth. And again, a lot of this comes back down to just kind of this inner tension between the two, right? They believe this lie, but something feels a little scratchy, a little itchy on side. There's cognitive dissonance in that opening scene. And if you can emphasize that in that opening scene, it's this great opportunity for conflict, very pertinent conflict that will build into the need for the external plot conflict that will develop more and more as you get deeper and deeper into the story. When you're picking your characteristic moment and trying to come up with this scene that's the best one to introduce your character, really think about the character's relationship to the story's thematic lie and truth. And how can you dramatize that? How can you bring that out? How can you show readers how this lie is affecting the character, both how it has been functional up to this point in their life and how it is becoming increasingly dysfunctional and will become more blatantly so, where they have to do something about it once they reach the inciting event in the first plot point later in the first act. And with this, inherent within this, if this is how you begin your story with this consciousness, you will also be introducing your story's most important thematic elements. So that in itself will help you create a thematic unity with everything that follows in your story, and also ideally a tonal unity, right? You're setting a tone for what's going to follow in the story, for how your character interacts with this lie. So maybe it's quite funny, or maybe it's very serious. Maybe it's like life and death stakes, or, maybe it's ironic, whatever the tone that you're trying to achieve within your story that is appropriate for how you're dealing with this character's arc. That's what you have the opportunity to really lay the foundation for in the beginning of your story. And if you're able to do that, it's an amazing way to really create just this sense of cohesion for your entire story. From the very beginning on, there's never a sense that this is like a prologue or just something that's tacked on, to get the necessary introductions out of the way. It feels very real and very pertinent and just plunges readers right into the heart of what you're trying to tell right from the beginning. So one final thing to think about in regards to how you introduce characters in the beginning of your story is the setting. So the beginning of the story, the first act, symbolically speaking, takes place in what I call the normal world. So the normal world is in contrast to what's going to be the adventure world of the conflict in the second act. And that's true, no matter what your character's adventure is, even if it's very prosaic and is not, going on a quest or something like that. It's just that symbolic contrast between this is the normal world that they have always known up to this point. This is all they have known, right? And ultimately what we're symbolizing is the perspective, right? It's still that lie. The normal world represents the world of the lie. It is a world in which the character has been able to operate with this mindset, with this limited mindset, because it's an equally limited world. And this world, it can be a literal world, if you're telling science fiction, or it can be something really subtle. It can be perhaps they actually leave this setting at the first end of the first act, But perhaps it's just something about the setting itself that shifts. And that shift could simply be the character's perspective of it. But the point, and again, that's a whole other topic, and I will link some resources down below. But the main point of considering your normal world in your story's beginning is to think about how you can, choose a setting for this opening scene and this opening dynamic with your protagonist that really dramatizes the opening situation that they're in their life. Where do they find themselves? How is it good? How is it bad? And why is it going to change? Because that's what happens in a story. Everything changes. So what you're showing readers here is what's going to change. You're showing them the place from which your character is going to arc. And you truly cannot have a powerful character arc or show a powerful change within a story's plot unless you lay the groundwork and set the foundation for what is changing, what is going to be changed or even destroyed. Because that lays the groundwork for stakes, it sets the context for why this story needs to happen, and also how difficult it inevitably will be for the characters, which really, has the ability to deepen a reader's investment in what you're writing about. Think about ways that you can choose a setting or highlight aspects of your story's main setting that really bring to life your character's dilemma, right? This growing tension between this limited perspective and this truth that they're going to be evolving into. I think we see this clearly in dystopian stories, which obviously have created this entirely, in many ways, symbolic setting to represent the character's inner wasteland in a lot of ways. And sometimes that changes and sometimes it doesn't, depending on what type of arc the character is taking. Hunger Games comes to mind, right? She completely changes setting into this, grotesquely corrupt and glitzy and glamorous world in the capital. That's a stark contrast to where we see her in the beginning, in her district, which is, run down and everybody's kind of starving. And so that's a perfect example of how to create a setting and really utilize aspects of it to create characteristic moments, to set up the necessity for the plot conflict that will come, and to show how your character will interact with it based on their relationship to the story's primary thematic lie and truth. So I know that's a lot of information. Again, beginnings are so complex. So I think I do hear from a lot of writers who get very frustrated with their beginnings and feel like, they just can't get it right. And I completely relate to this. I've never been happy with the beginning I've written ever. But I think just, give yourself a little grace. There is so much here. Writing a good first chapter is an art form unto itself. You can be a master of all the chapters that come after it, and still that first chapter, it is a tough little nut to crack. So yeah, I think this is just some things to consider. Again, I'll leave some resources down below. And in the next video, next month, we will be talking about some considerations for how to set up the plot in your story's beginning and first chapter. And then after that, I will be talking about endings, how we can kind of bring that all full circle, and how beginnings and endings are really very linked. And then if you can set up one correctly, then you have all the tools you need to set up the other correctly. So I hope that was useful. Thank you for watching. And if you'd like to stay up to date on all the content that I produce, you can do that. The best way to do that is by signing up for my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. And you can do that. If you do that, you'll receive info on all the posts that I do. I do a weekly lengthy text post every Monday with lots of information, as well as all of the products and books that I put out, just all kinds of resources. If you're interested in that, you can find all of that by signing up for my mailing list. So I hope you will have a good week and happy writing.